Welcome to the Monotone Museum. Tonight's exhibit is about Doc Holliday. If you enjoy calm, carefully told history, please like and subscribe to help preserve these stories. Now, settle in, and let's begin. Tonight, we are going somewhere warm, to the American South first, to the Georgia of the 1850s and 1860s, with its red clay soil and its white-columned houses, and its particular culture of honor and courtesy, and the specific violence that lies just beneath the surface of cultures built on those things. And then west, always west, to the cattle towns of Kansas and the mining camps of Colorado and Arizona, to the saloons and the gambling tables and the dry desert air that was the only medicine available for the thing that was killing him. The man we are going to follow tonight is one of the most misunderstood figures in American history, which is saying something given the competition. He has been played in the movies by Victor Mature and Kirk Douglas and Val Kilmer and Dennis Quaid, and every one of those performances captured something true about him and missed something essential, because the essential thing about Doc Holliday is not the guns or the gambling or the legend. The essential thing is the dying. He was dying from the moment he was 22 years old. He knew it. He lived with this knowledge every day for 15 years, and what he did with it, how he chose to spend the time he had been told he didn't have, is one of the most interesting things about any person in the history of the American West. His name was John Henry Holliday. He was a dentist. He played piano. He read Latin. He died in a bed in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, at 36 years old, looking at his bare feet, and his last words were either profound or funny depending on how you look at them, and they were probably both. This is his story. John Henry Holliday was born on August 14, 1851, in Griffin, Georgia, a prosperous small city in the red clay Piedmont country of central Georgia, the kind of place that the antebellum South produced in Tazentwold's abundance, orderly, hierarchical, deeply certain of its own civilization, built on foundations that the Civil War was about to destroy completely and permanently. His father was Henry Burroughs Holliday, a pharmacist and civic leader who had served in the Mexican-American War and would serve again in the Confederate Army, a man of standing in the Griffin community, whose son John Henry was expected to inherit that standing and build on it in the ways that Southern gentlemen's sons were expected to build on their father's standing, through education, through a respectable profession, through the maintenance of the social codes that defined what a gentleman was. His mother was Alice Jane McKay Holliday, and she was the person who shaped him most fundamentally. She was educated, musical, warm, the kind of mother who read to her children and talked to them about ideas and conveyed through the texture of daily life that the life of the mind was worth living. She played piano, and she taught John Henry to play piano, and he was good at it. Genuinely good, with the kind of musical intelligence that is partly technical and partly something harder to name, an ability to feel the music from the inside. That is either a gift or it isn't. She also had tuberculosis. She had it when John Henry was born, had been living with it for years, and in January of 1866, when John Henry was 14 years old, she died of it. He had watched his mother die of the disease that would eventually kill him, and he had watched it for years before the end, and the specific quality of that dying, the cough, the slow diminishment, the particular way that consumption took people, was something he carried in his body as knowledge before he carried it as diagnosis. His father remarried quickly within 3 months of Alice's death, a decision that John Henry never entirely forgave, or so the family history suggests. The new wife was a woman named Rachel Martin, and the marriage produced a half-brother named Robert, who John Henry was fond of. But the speed of his father's remarriage had the quality of a betrayal, in the eyes of a 14-year-old boy who was still deep in grief for his mother. Something between John Henry and his father shifted and never quite shifted back. He was educated at the Valdosta Institute, and then, in 1870, he enrolled at the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in Philadelphia, one of the finest dental schools in the country. A decision that reflected both his academic ability and the practical understanding that a gentleman needed a profession, and that dentistry was a profession that combined the manual dexterity and the scientific knowledge that John Henry possessed in abundance. He graduated in March 1872, 1 month before his 21st birthday, with a degree that certified him as Dr. John Henry Holliday, and he returned to Georgia to set up practice. He was, by every account, an excellent dentist. This fact tends to get lost in the subsequent legend, but it is worth dwelling on. He had been trained at a rigorous institution in an era when dental education was becoming genuinely scientific, and he practiced with the precision and the attention to patient comfort that his training had instilled. His patience in Georgia and later in Dallas, Texas, where he briefly practiced before the West pulled him further along, found him skilled and gentle and possessed of the particular bedside manner that the best practitioners develop. The ability to put a frightened patient at ease with the combination of competence and calm. He had his diagnosis within months of opening his practice. The cough that he had noticed in himself, had been trying not to notice, had been attributing to other causes, was examined by physicians who knew what they were looking at. Tuberculosis. Consumption. The disease that had killed his mother. He was 22 years old. The physicians told him he might have months, certainly not years. The Georgia climate, with its heat and humidity, was the worst possible environment for a tubercular patient. He needed dry air. He needed the West. He packed his dental equipment, and his pistol and his deck of cards and whatever remained of the life he had been building in Georgia, and he headed for Texas. He was never coming back. He knew this. He was 22 years old, and he was dying, and the only thing left to decide was what to do with the time. He arrived in Dallas in 1873 and opened a dental practice with a partner, and for a few months, he tried. He genuinely tried to be the dentist he had trained to be, to build the professional life that his education had prepared him for, to make the future that his father had envisioned for him work in the dry Texas air that the doctors had prescribed. The coughing made it difficult. Tuberculosis attacks the lungs, and what it does to the lungs produces a cough, chronic, sometimes violent, impossible to control, that is not reassuring in a dentist. Patients who were already anxious about dental procedures were not made less anxious by a dentist whose coughing fits interrupted the work. The practice struggled. The income was insufficient. And John Henry Holliday, 22 years old, dying by medical certificate, had begun to realize that the respectable professional future was not going to be his future after all. He had always been good at cards. This is one of those qualities that some people have and some people don't. The mathematical intelligence combined with the psychological acuity to read other players, combined with the particular nerve that allows a person to bet on uncertainty without being paralyzed by it. He had played since boyhood in the way that Southern boys of his class played cards, and he was better than most of them. In Texas, in the saloons and gambling establishments that were the social centers of the Cattletown frontier, he discovered that he was better than most of anyone. Gambling in the 1870s frontier West was not the vice it was in respectable societies. Imagination. It was an industry, a serious commercial enterprise conducted in establishments that ranged from crude to remarkably sophisticated, and that provided the entertainment and the social function that the frontier's lack of other institutions left unfilled. The professional gambler, the man who made his living at the tables, occupied a specific social position that was ambiguous in interesting ways. He was not respectable exactly, but he was not entirely disreputable either. He provided a service. He ran an honest game, which distinguished him from the cheats and the grifters. He was, in his own way, a professional. Doc Holliday became a professional gambler in Texas in 1873 and 1874, and he was extraordinarily good at it. He played faro primarily, the game that dominated the frontier gambling world, a fast-moving card game in which players bet on which cards would be drawn from a dealing box and which rewarded mathematical precision and cool-headedness under pressure. He also played poker, which rewarded the psychological intelligence he had in equal measure with the mathematical. He won consistently enough to make a living, and the living was better than the dental practice had been. The guns came as part of the same package. A professional gambler in the frontier West carried money, always had cash on him by the nature of the work, and carrying money in an environment where violence was common and law enforcement was inconsistent made weapons not optional. He learned to shoot in Texas, or refined what he already knew, and he was good at this too. Not in the theatrical, trick-shot way of the dime novel heroes, but in the practical, specific way that actually mattered. He was fast enough and accurate, enough and calm enough under pressure that the people who might have considered robbing him or shooting him tended to reconsider. His first significant trouble with the law came in Dallas in 1874, when he was involved in a shooting affray near a saloon. The details are murky. The historical record for Doc Holliday's early Texas years is fragmentary, dependent on newspaper accounts that were themselves fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. What is clear is that he shot at someone, possibly hit someone, and decided that Dallas was no longer the right place for him. He moved on. He would move on many times in the years that followed, staying ahead of trouble or ahead of the law or ahead of the specific social exhaustion that comes from overstaying your welcome in any particular place. He drifted through Texas and then north and west, following the cattle trade that was the economic engine of the frontier in the 1870s. Jacksboro, Denison, Fort Griffin, the towns along the cattle trails that were briefly prosperous and then moved on as the cattle trade moved on, the whole landscape of the frontier economy in constant motion, never quite settling into permanence. He gambled in each of these places and won more than he lost, and coughed through the nights and got up the next morning and did it again. He also, somewhere in this period, met Kate. Big Nose Kate, her actual name was Mary Catherine Horany, a Hungarian immigrant's daughter who had been orphaned young and had made her way in the world in the ways available to women of limited resources in the frontier West. She was a prostitute, and she was also intelligent and fierce and possessed, of a personality that matched Doc Holliday's own in its intensity and its refusal to be managed by anyone. They fought constantly and separated repeatedly and found their way back to each other with a regularity that suggested the fighting was, for both of them, part of what the relationship was. She loved him. This is the simplest and most important thing about Kate, and it is easy to lose it in the complicated history of their relationship. She loved John Henry Holliday, who was dying, who was difficult, who was a gambler in every sense of the word, with cards, with his life, with the patience of the people around him. And she stayed. Not always. Not without breaks and departures, and the specific rage that comes from loving someone who will not be saved. But she stayed. And she cared for him during the worst of his illness episodes, and she was with him through more of his story than the legend usually acknowledges. He met Wyatt Earp in Fort Griffin, Texas in 1877, and the friendship that began. In that meeting was the most important relationship of his adult life and one of the most extraordinary friendships in the history of the American West. Wyatt Earp in 1877 was 29 years old, a tall, lean, cold-eyed man of considerable physical presence and a reputation for effective, if unorthodox, law enforcement that had followed him from Wichita, where he had served as a policeman, to Dodge City, where he was serving as assistant marshal. He was in Fort Griffin looking for a fugitive, Dave Rudebour, a train robber, and he came to the gambling saloons because the gambling saloons were where information lived in the frontier towns. And the man running the faro game at Shancy's saloon was a Georgia dentist named Holliday who had a reputation for knowing everything that happened in every town he passed through. Doc pointed Earp toward Rudebour's trail and saved him from what might have been a dangerous situation into the bargain. There was trouble that evening, and Doc positioned himself in a way that made it clear to the men who might have started something that starting something was inadvisable. Earp noticed this. He was a man who noticed things. What happened next, over the years that followed, is one of the great slow-developing friendships. The kind that builds not through a single dramatic moment, but through the accumulation of smaller ones, through repeated instances of one person standing up for the other, through the discovery of a mutual respect that neither man would have predicted and both men came to rely on. They were, on the surface, an improbable pair, the lawman and the gambler, the Kansas man and the Georgia gentleman, the sober and the hard-drinking, the healthy and the dying. What they shared was a specific quality of nerve, a willingness to stand in difficult situations and not flinch, and a personal code that, whatever its specific content, both men took seriously enough to back with their lives. Earp said of Holliday later that he was the most skillful gambler and the nerviest, speediest, deadliest man with a six-gun he had ever seen. This assessment has been repeated so often that it has become part of the legend, and the legend has inflated it into something that the historical record doesn't quite support. But what Earp was describing was real. Not a superhuman gunfighter, but a man of extraordinary composure under pressure who did not become less himself when things went wrong, but more himself, the way certain people do, as if danger clarified rather than obscured. Earp also said, in a statement that is perhaps more revealing than the famous one about the shooting, that Holliday was a loyal friend to those he liked. That among those he liked, Earp counted himself fortunate to be included. That Holliday had more than once risked his life for Earp's sake. This is the core of it. The friendship between Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday was not a partnership of professional convenience or a legend manufactured by dime novelists. It was a genuine human attachment between two difficult men who found in each other something they could not find elsewhere, and who honored that finding with a consistency that their complicated lives otherwise rarely showed. Dodge City, Kansas, in 1878 was the wickedest city in the West, or so it advertised itself, and in this case the advertising was not entirely dishonest. The cattle trade made it rich for a season each year, and the cowboys who had driven the herds north from Texas arrived with months of wages and the compressed energy of men who had been working hard in difficult conditions and needed to release it somewhere. The release happened in the saloons and the dance halls and the gambling establishments of Front Street, and it sometimes happened with gunfire. Doc arrived in Dodge in 1878 and set up at the gambling tables, and Wyatt Earp was there as assistant. Marshall and the two men moved through the violent social world of Dodge City in a kind of tandem that the town's inhabitants learned to read as a unit. Where Earp kept order through a combination of physical presence and the willingness to use his gun barrel on the skull of anyone who needed it, Doc kept order at the gambling tables through a combination of professional authority and the knowledge, which spread quickly through the town's social network, that cheating at his table or starting trouble near it was an activity with consequences. He was also, in Dodge City, genuinely liked. This is one of the things that gets lost in the legend of Doc Holliday, the charm. He was charming in the specific Southern way, with the elaborate courtesy and the dry wit, and the ability to make whoever he was talking to feel that they had his complete attention and that his complete attention was worth having. He read people quickly and accurately. He was funny, genuinely funny, with the timing and the deadpan delivery that actual comedic intelligence requires, not the labored humor of someone trying to be funny, but the effortless comedy of someone who found the world absurd and was willing to say so. He coughed through Dodge City the way he coughed through everywhere. The tuberculosis never let up, never gave him a season of false health that might have produced false hope. He managed it with whiskey, which was not as irrational as it sounds. Alcohol is a mild vasodilator, and may have provided some genuine symptomatic relief, and in 1878 there was no better medicine available. He managed it with the dry air, which was genuinely helpful and which the doctors had been right about, and he managed it with the particular stubbornness that had been keeping him alive for 6 years past the doctor's initial prognosis. Tombstone, Arizona Territory, in 1880 and 1881 was one of the most dramatic places in America. A silver mining boom town in the high desert of the Sonoran Basin, at an elevation of 4,700 feet in the Dragoon Mountain country of what is now southeastern Arizona, producing silver ore in quantities that were making certain people very rich very quickly and attracting the full range of human character that sudden wealth always attracts. The Earp brothers arrived in Tombstone in late 1879, Wyatt and his brothers Virgil and Morgan, along with their wives and companions, including Doc Holliday and Kate. They had been drawn by the same thing that drew everyone, the money and the opportunities that money created. Virgil Earp became the town marshal. Wyatt had various business interests and served as a deputy. Morgan worked as a lawman. The Earp family was positioning itself as the law and order faction in a town that badly needed law and order and was already divided about what form that order should take. The opposing faction was the Cochise County Cowboys, a loose confederation of ranchers, rustlers, and generally violent men who operated in the surrounding countryside, whose interests were specifically opposed to the kind of law enforcement the Earps represented, and whose leading figures included the Clanton family and the McClory brothers. The Cowboys were not a formal organization. They were a network of men who shared economic interests and a cultural disposition toward resolving disputes outside the legal system, and they had been doing so successfully for long enough that the arrival of the Earps represented a genuine threat to the arrangements they had built. The conflict between the Earps and the Cowboys had been building for most of 1881. Cattle stolen, accusations exchanged, threats made, and threats returned. The political and legal machinery of Cochise County mobilized by both sides in a struggle that was partly about law and order and partly about money and power and the specific personal animosities that accumulate when the same group of people are in conflict long enough. Doc Holliday was in Tombstone through all of this, gambling at the Oriental Saloon and the other establishments of Allen Street, coughing through the nights, watching the conflict develop with the detached attention of a man who had made a practice of watching conflicts develop. He was not central to the politics of Tombstone. He was Wyatt Earp's friend, which put him in the Earp camp by association, but he had no particular stake in the outcome of the Earp-Cowboy conflict, except insofar as his friend Wyatt's safety was affected. He would stand up for his friend. This was not a calculation. It was simply what he did. October 26, 1881, the gunfight at the OK Corral. The name is slightly wrong. The confrontation did not actually take place inside the OK Corral, but in the vacant lot next to Fly's photographic gallery on Fremont Street, about a half block from the Corral's rear entrance. This geographic imprecision has been noted by every serious historian of the event and has made essentially no impression on the public imagination, which has decided that the OK Corral is where it happened and is not going to be corrected. The gunfight lasted approximately 30 seconds. This is the fact that is most startling to people who have seen the movie versions, which tend to run to several minutes of dramatic exchanges. 30 seconds. In 30 seconds, 3 men were dead. Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton, and 3 men were wounded, Virgil Earp, Morgan Earp, and Doc Holliday. Wyatt Earp was the only participant who was neither killed nor wounded. Doc Holliday was shot through the hip, a wound that grazed him, painful but not serious. He had gone into the confrontation with a nickel-plated revolver and a shotgun that Virgil Earp had given him, concealed under his long grey coat, and he had used both. Exactly what he did in those 30 seconds has been disputed since the afternoon it happened. The eyewitness accounts are contradictory, the participants' own accounts vary, and the chaos of a close-range gunfight in a narrow space produces exactly the kind of perceptual confusion that makes reliable reconstruction difficult. What is clear is that Doc was there, that he was effective, that he stood with the Earps when standing with them was genuinely dangerous, and that he did this not because it was legally his responsibility, he had no official status as a lawman, but because Wyatt Earp was his friend, and his friend needed him. He was asked about this later. Why had he been there? He said it was his pleasure. He said it with the dry Georgia courtesy that he applied to everything, and he meant it. And the meaning of it was that Wyatt Earp had stood by him when standing by him was inconvenient, and he was returning the favor, and that this was what friendship meant, and that the OK Corral gunfight was therefore, in his accounting, not a violent incident in a difficult town, but an expression of loyalty. And loyalty was one of the things he took seriously. What followed the gunfight at the OK Corral was, in some ways, darker and more consequential than the gunfight itself. The Earps were charged with murder. The Cowboys' political connections in Cochise County were sufficient to produce a murder indictment, though the charges were eventually dropped after a preliminary hearing determined that the shooting had been legally justified. The Cowboys did not consider this settled. On December 28, 1881, Virgil Earp was ambushed on Allen Street, shotgunned from a darkened doorway. His left arm shattered so severely that it would have to be partially amputated. Leaving him permanently disabled, he survived. The men responsible were never formally identified, though the identities were known in Tombstone, and the responsibility was laid at the feet of the Cowboy faction. On March 18, 1882, Morgan Earp was shot through a window while playing billiards at Hatch's saloon. The bullet entered his back and tore through his spinal cord. He died within an hour in his brother Wyatt's arms, on the billiard table where he had fallen. What Wyatt Earp did next is called the Earp Vendetta Ride, a 4-week campaign of extrajudicial violence in which Wyatt, his brother Warren, Doc Holliday, and a small group of allies tracked down and killed the men they held responsible for the attacks on Virgil and Morgan. It was not legal. Wyatt Earp had no authority for what he did. He was operating outside the law that he had spent his career enforcing, and he knew it, and he did it anyway because Morgan was dead and Virgil was crippled, and the law had failed to protect them, and he was not going to wait for it to fail again. Doc Holliday rode with him for every mile of it. He was 30 years old. His tuberculosis was significantly advanced from the relatively manageable state it had been in when he arrived in the West 8 years earlier. He was coughing blood. He was thin in a way that went beyond the natural thinness of a lean man and into the specific gauntness of someone whose body was consuming itself. The Vendetta Ride took them through the mountains and desert of southeastern Arizona in the early spring, in conditions that were difficult for a healthy man and were, for Doc, close to suicidal, he rode anyway. When asked later why he had done it, why a dying man had chosen to spend what remained of his health and possibly his life on a vendetta that was not technically his business, he said that Wyatt was his friend. He said it as if this were a complete and self-sufficient answer, because for him it was. The Vendetta Ride killed several of the cowboys who had been involved in the attacks on Virgil and Morgan. Exactly how many and exactly which ones is disputed by historians, with the evidence fragmentary and the participants' own accounts self-serving in the ways that the accounts of men who have committed extrajudicial killings tend to be self-serving. What is clear is that by the time it was over, the cowboys as an organized force in Cochise County were effectively broken, and the Earps had left Arizona and were not coming back. Doc left with them. He had helped with the vendetta, and he had been named in the warrant that Cochise County issued for the participants, and Arizona was no longer a place where he could safely remain. He went to Colorado, to Denver first, and then to the mountain resort town of Leadville, and eventually to Glenwood Springs, where the sulfur hot springs were supposed to be beneficial for tubercular conditions. He would not see Wyatt Earp again. The friendship that had defined his adult life continued in correspondence, in the particular closeness of people who have been through something together that most people never experience, but the physical proximity that had allowed it to express itself most fully was over. They were men of the moving West, and the West had moved them to different places, and Doc's body was not going to allow him to keep following it much further. Doc Holliday spent his last 5 years in Colorado, and those years have a quality that is different from everything that came before. Slower, more interior, the story of a man who has done most of what he was going to do and is now in the process of finishing. He gambled in Leadville, which was a silver mining boomtown in the high Rockies at an elevation of over 10,000 feet, the highest city in the United States, where the air was thin enough to make breathing difficult for healthy people and was both beneficial for tuberculosis, as the thin, dry air slowed the disease's progression, and brutal on his already compromised lungs, which had to work harder to extract oxygen from the altitude. He was in a kind of physiological negotiation with the landscape, the altitude helping him and hurting him simultaneously. He had another shooting incident in Leadville in 1884 when he shot and wounded a former lawman named Hyman Neal, known as Bud Ryan, in a saloon dispute. The incident was characteristic of the Leadville episodes of his life. The provocation was real, the response was arguably disproportionate, the legal outcome was acquittal on grounds of self-defense. He was charged and tried and found not guilty, and he left Leadville shortly afterward and moved to Denver and then to Glenwood Springs. In Denver, he had a famous encounter with a gambler and confidence man named Bat Masterson's enemy. Another shooting incident, another legal proceeding, another move when the dust settled. He was becoming, in these Colorado years, a man who had outlasted most of the world that had made him. The cattle towns were gone or going. Tombstone was quiet. The wild frontier that had provided the context for his particular set of skills was being replaced by something more settled, more institutional, more resistant to the individual operating outside the structures. He was also, in these years, genuinely ill in a way that the earlier years had only previewed. The tuberculosis that had been killing him for 15 years was now killing him on a more immediate schedule. He was thin to the point of transparency. He coughed blood with a regularity that was alarming to those who witnessed it, and was, to Doc himself, simply the sound that his life made. He kept gambling because gambling was what he did, and he kept drinking because the drinking helped him manage the symptoms, and because at this point managing the symptoms was a sufficient reason for anything. He arrived in Glenwood Springs in May of 1887. The sulfur hot springs there had a reputation for therapeutic benefit in tubercular cases. The mineral water was believed to have healing properties, and the town had been developing as a health resort for the wealthy consumptives, who could afford to try every available remedy. Doc could not have been described as wealthy, but he had enough to manage the accommodations at the Glenwood Hotel, and the spring air was clean and dry, and the mountains that surrounded the town were beautiful in the way that the Rocky Mountain country is always beautiful. He lived in Glenwood Springs for the last 5 months of his life. He gambled when he could manage it, which became less frequent as the summer progressed and the disease advanced. He received visitors, not many, but some. He corresponded with people from his past. He lay in bed in the hotel, and he looked out the window at the mountains, and he thought about whatever a man thinks about when he has been dying for 15 years and is finally close enough to the end to see it clearly. Kate was there for part of it. She had come and gone throughout his Colorado years in the pattern that their relationship had always followed: the arrival, the caregiving, the fighting, the departure, the inevitable return. In Glenwood Springs, she came and cared for him through some of the worst months and then left again, for reasons that the historical record does not make entirely clear. She survived him by many decades, living into the 1940s, and she talked about him in her old age with the mixture of love and exasperation that the relationship had always contained. He was in bed in November of 1887. He had been in bed for some time. The tuberculosis had advanced to the point where getting up was difficult and staying up was impossible for long, and the body that had carried him through 15 years of dying was finally running out of the stubbornness that had sustained it. On November 8, 1887, Doc Holliday died. He was 36 years old. He had been told at 22 that he had months to live. And he had lived for 14 more years, not comfortably, not easily, not in the way that a person who is not dying lives, but fully, in the specific sense of a man who understood that time was not unlimited and had spent it accordingly. His last words have been reported in various forms. The most commonly cited version is that he looked down at his bare feet. He had always assumed he would die with his boots on, in the frontier tradition, shot or stabbed or in some other violent circumstances. And he said, "This is funny. He died in a bed. He died of the disease that had been his companion for 15 years. He died with his boots off, which was not what he had expected, and he found this amusing, and he said so, and then he was gone." The legend of Doc Holliday is enormous and almost entirely wrong in its specifics, and the wrongness is instructive because it tells us what the American imagination needed him to be, rather than what he was. The dime novels and the early Western films needed a deadly gunfighter who had killed dozens of men, who was as fast with a pistol as thought, who moved through the frontier world leaving a trail of dead men behind him. The actual historical record supports approximately 1 confirmed kill in Doc's entire life. A scout named Mike Gordon, whom he shot in 1879 in Las Vegas, New Mexico, after Gordon became threatening. There may have been others: the Fort Griffin incident, the Tombstone events, the Vendetta ride. But the numbers are small and disputed, and the legendary figure who killed 20 or 30 or 50 men is a fantasy. The legend needed a romantic figure, so it gave him a great romance with a woman named Josephine or sometimes Katie, and it gave the romance a tragic operatic quality that the actual relationship with Big Nose Kate, which was real and important and considerably messier than opera allows, did not quite provide. Kate was not a tragic heroine. She was a tough, smart, complicated woman who loved a dying man and fought with him regularly and outlived him by half a century, and her story is interesting precisely because it does not fit the operatic template. The legend needed him to be a scout for Custer, and a buffalo hunter, and a Pony Express rider, and various other frontier archetypes, and he was none of these things. He was a dentist who became a professional gambler who became, by accident and necessity, and the specific logic of the frontier world, someone who was occasionally involved in violence. This is less mythologically satisfying than the legend, but considerably more interesting as a human story. What the legend did get right is the friendship with Wyatt Earp. That was real. The specific quality of Doc's loyalty, his willingness to stand beside his friend in situations that were dangerous and legally dubious, and entirely not his problem, was real, and was as significant as any account has made it. The friendship is the truest thing in the legend, which is unusual for legends. The legend also got right the tuberculosis, the specific drama of a dying man living as fully as he could for as long as he could. This is not a legend. It is the documented truth, and it is one of the genuinely remarkable things about his life. 15 years of dying, and what he did with them. He has been played by actors who were handsome in the conventional Hollywood sense, Kirk Douglas's jaw, Val Kilmer's cheekbones, and there is some historical evidence that the real Doc Holliday was conventionally handsome in a thin, consumptive Georgian way. There are photographs of him that survive, and they show a lean-faced man with a drooping mustache and light eyes, and an expression of considerable self-possession, a man who is aware of being photographed and has decided to present himself in a specific way, and is successfully doing so. The self-possession in the photographs is consistent with every account of him in life. He was always in command of his own presentation, always the author of his own appearance to the world. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall, which was above average for his era. He weighed around 160 pounds when healthy and less than that for most of his adult life, the tuberculosis keeping him lean in the way that diseases that attack the body's resources tend to keep their hosts lean. He dressed well, the Southern gentleman's understanding that clothing was a form of self-presentation and that self-presentation mattered was something he maintained even in the frontier West, where the standard of dress was not high and where his well-cut coats and clean linen were themselves a kind of statement about who he was and where he came from. He smelled of bay rum and whiskey. This is documented by people who knew him. The specific combination of the hair tonic that gentlemen of his era used and the bourbon that he used for medication and comfort and the management of the specific social anxiety that performance requires. He was a performer in the way that all professional gamblers are performers, sitting at a table, projecting the specific combination of confidence and inscrutability that wins at faro and poker requires the management of impression, as much as the management of cards. Doc Holliday left very little that you can hold in your hands. There is no house, no property, no accumulated estate of any kind. He died with approximately nothing, the professional gambler's characteristic relationship with money being one of flux rather than accumulation. What came in, going back out, at the tables or spending on hotel rooms and whiskey, and the specific small pleasures of a man who does not expect to live long and sees no reason to save for a future that isn't coming. There is no grave marker, or rather, there is a marker, but it is a cenotaph, a memorial without a body because the location of the actual burial is unknown. Doc was buried in Linwood Cemetery in Glenwood Springs, but the exact plot was not recorded with the precision that later generations would have wished, and the Colorado winters and the passage of time did what they do to unmarked graves. The Bisquier Fort marker that exists in the cemetery reads Doc Holliday, 1852 to 1887. And this is my affair. And the last line is from the most famous account of his death, which has him saying those words when a priest offered to pray for him in his final hours. He is in the stories. This is where he actually lives. In the accounts of people who knew him, in the court records, and the newspaper stories and the memoirs and the interviews, in the historical record that has been assembled by the historians, who have spent careers trying to separate the real from the legendary. He is in Wyatt Earp's statements about him, which are the most reliable single source for his character and which describe a man that the legend has both inflated and diminished, more human than the legend allows, and more genuinely impressive. He is also, perhaps most significantly, in the idea of him. The idea of a dying man who chose to spend his limited time in the full exercise of whatever he was, rather than in the diminished, protected existence that his condition might have seemed to recommend. He could have gone home to Georgia. He could have lived quietly in some dry climate town, conserving his strength, staying out of trouble, perhaps extending his life by a few additional years of careful management. He chose not to. He chose the saloons and the cattle towns and the gunfights and the loyalty to a friendship that took him to Tombstone and to the vendetta ride, and to the end of his life still himself, still playing cards, still coughing through the nights, and getting up the next morning to do it again. This is the thing about Doc Holliday that the legend gestures at without quite capturing. Not the deadliness, which was modest by historical standards, and not the glamour, which was real but complicated, but the specific quality of his relationship to his own dying. He knew he was dying, he had known for 15 years, and he decided, consciously, repeatedly, in the face of every practical argument for a different decision, to live rather than to wait. This is not a simple thing. It is not universally the right choice. There are people who are right to conserve and protect and manage their health, to give the time they have the best chance of being the most time possible. Doc Holliday made the opposite choice, and it may have cost him years. But the years he had were lived at a temperature that most people's longer lives do not reach, and the argument that the temperature was worth the cost is an argument that he had already made and settled before the rest of us got here to debate it. Go back to him now, in the Glenwood Hotel in the fall of 1887. The room is small and clean, with a window that looks out toward the Colorado River Valley and the canyon walls above it. The aspen trees on the canyon sides gone gold with October, the river running, clear and cold below. He is in bed. He has been in bed for most of the past weeks. He is 36 years old, which does not seem old, except that his 36 years have had more in them than most people's 70, and his body has been working harder than most bodies work in 3 lifetimes, and it is done working. The eye, tuberculosis, has progressed to the terminal stage. Both lungs compromised, the body unable to absorb sufficient oxygen, the systems that have been compensating for the disease's damage for 15 years finally running out of capacity to compensate. Kiki is lucid. This is one of the things that tuberculosis does differently from many terminal illnesses. It can leave the mind clear while the body fails, and Doc Holliday's mind was always clear, even at the worst of the disease, except when he chose to make it less clear with bourbon, which was his prerogative. He is lying in the bed and he is thinking, and what he is thinking about we cannot know for certain, but we can make educated guesses based on who he was. He is probably thinking about Wyatt, the friendship that had been the organizing relationship of his adult life, the constant in a life of considerable inconstancy, the person who had given him what no one else had quite managed to give, the experience of being fully known and fully valued, dying and difficult and all. They have not seen each other in years. The correspondence has continued. He knows Wyatt is alive and well, that the vendetta ride and Tombstone are behind him, that he has moved on in the practical way that Wyatt always managed to move on. He is probably thinking about Georgia. The red clay roads and the magnolia trees and his mother playing piano in the parlor and the life that was supposed to happen and did not happen because the disease made it impossible and because he decided, when the disease made the original plan impossible, that a different plan was not worse but different. He is probably not regretting Georgia, exactly. He is probably remembering it with the specific quality of feeling that terminal patients have for the places that shape them, the recognition of origin, the acknowledgement that you came from somewhere and that the somewhere mattered even if you spent your whole life leaving it. He is probably thinking about the cards, the specific pleasure of a good hand played well, the faro box clicking through its cycles, the poker table with its particular social dynamics, the life at the tables that had been his life for 15 years. He was good at it. He was genuinely, technically, professionally good at it, and the pleasure of being good at something, any something, is one of the real pleasures of being alive, and he had had it consistently. The priest comes. Doc declines the last rites or accepts them, depending on which account you follow. The historical record is not entirely consistent here, as it is not consistent on many of the details of his death. What is consistent is the last observation, delivered in the moment before the end, looking at his bare feet. This is funny. He had expected to die with his boots on. He had expected a violent death in a cattle town or a mining camp or on a dusty street in Arizona. He had not expected a Hotel room and a clean bed and the gold aspens outside the window and his boots neatly placed beside the door. He found this funny because he found most things funny because that was who he was, because a man who has been dying for 15 years has had a long time to develop a relationship with the absurdity of the situation, and his relationship with it was humor. He died. The light in the room was the clean, sharp light of a Colorado autumn morning. The river was running below the canyon. The aspens were gold. He was 36 years old. Think of him now at the gambling table. Not the dying man in the hotel room. That man is at peace. But the living man, the man in his prime in Dodge City or Tombstone, sitting at the faro table in the lamplight with the bourbon glass at his elbow and the cards in motion and the room full of the noise of the frontier night. He is watching the room with the peripheral attention of an experienced gambler, tracking the cards in front of him and the people around him simultaneously, processing information on multiple channels without apparent effort. He is dressed well, the long coat, the clean linen, the mustache carefully trimmed. He looks like what he is, a southern gentleman at a gambling table in a cattle town, which is a specific and unlikely thing to be, and he knows it and finds it gently amusing. Someone across the room says something that he catches, a fragment of conversation that has a specific inflection. He glances up. He assesses. He returns his attention to the cards. Nothing is going to happen tonight that requires him to do more than glance. He coughs. The room is accustomed to the cough. He lifts the bourbon glass, takes a measured sip, sets it down. The cough subsides. He returns to the cards. Wyatt Earp is somewhere in the room. Not at the table. Wyatt is not a gambler. But nearby. The specific comfort of knowing that your friend is in the room, that the person who has your back is present. They do not need to speak. The presence is enough. The night goes on. The cards move through the faro box. The room fills and empties and fills again with the people of the frontier night. Cowboys and miners and merchants and lawmen and the full human range of a town at the edge of the world, people who have come from somewhere and are going somewhere. And I hear right now, in the lamplight, playing cards or watching cards or drinking at the bar or talking in the corners. Doc is in the middle of it and slightly outside it, simultaneously present to every detail of what is happening at the table and in the room, and also somewhere slightly elsewhere in the private country that illness creates, the place where you live when your body is reminding you constantly that it is a temporary arrangement. He is not sad. This needs to be said, because the legend of Doc Holliday tends towards sadness, the tragic consumptive, the dying man, the life cut short. He was not primarily sad. He was primarily alive in the specific, attentive, fully present way that people who know their time is limited sometimes manage to be. He was at the table. He was in the room. He was here. Entirely here. Which is the most anyone can be anywhere. The bourbon glass is nearly empty. He signals for another. The cards are in his favor tonight. Not dramatically, not in the theatrical way of the movies, but in the steady professional way of a skilled player who understands the mathematics and the psychology and makes better decisions than the people across the table consistently over time. He picks up his cards. He considers them. He bets. Outside the window, the frontier night is enormous. The sky wide and dark above the cattle town. The stars thick above the Kansas plain or the Arizona desert or the Colorado mountains, wherever he is tonight. He has been in so many places, under so many versions of this sky. The sky is the same everywhere. The cards are the same everywhere. The specific texture of the room, the lamplight, the voices, the smoke, the sound of the dealing box, is his home, the home that he carried with him through 15 years of dying in the towns of the frontier west. He is home. He is exactly where he is supposed to be, doing exactly what he is supposed to be doing, being exactly who he is. For a man who was told at 22 that he was not going to be here, this is everything. This is the whole thing. The cards are dealt. He plays his hand. He plays it well. You are asleep, or nearly. The gambling table is very far away, and the lamplight is very far away, and the cough and the bourbon and the frontier night are dissolving into the general warm dark that is your own sleeping mind, generous and quiet and entirely without demand. Doc Holliday was told he was dying at 22, and he lived for 15 more years, and he spent them at the gambling table, and in the company of his friend, and in the dry air of the West that the doctors had prescribed, and in the specific, particular, irreplaceable texture of his own life, which no one else could have lived, and which he lived completely. He looked at his bare feet at the end, and he found it funny. This is a man who was paying attention to the last moment. This is a man who knew exactly where he was. You know where you are. You are warm and safe and held by the dark and by the bed and by the night that is turning gently around you, carrying you from one side of the dark toward morning without any effort. On your part, this is funny. He said it at the end, and he was right. The whole long, improbable business of being alive, the specific, unlikely comedy of it, the way it keeps going when you expected it to stop, the way it stops when you least expect it. It is funny, and it is also the most serious thing there is, and the best lives hold both of those things at once. He held them both, right to the end. Sleep now. The cards are dealt. The hand is played. Sleep.